Okay, here we go with our hallucinogens lecture. There's a lot of different drugs in this category, so we'll try and work through each of our levels of administration, behavioral effects, metabolism, adverse effects, and then tolerance, withdrawal, and addiction for each of those. All right, so to start out, what makes a drug a hallucinogen? How do we define that as a hallucinogen? And there's actually a lot of drugs can produce hallucinations, particularly at levels that are toxic, that are very high levels. And that's usually an indirect effect. It's not usually a direct effect of that drug. It's part of the toxicity that it's having on the brain that can induce the hallucinations. Hallucinations. Even extreme hunger and thirst can start to have effects on the brain that result in hallucinations. And even high fevers can sometimes result in hallucinations. So we're going to define hallucinogenic drugs as drugs who have their primary effect to produce distortions in perceptions, sensory perceptions, and they do that at low doses that are typically not toxic to the user. So it's a direct effect, not an indirect effect. And these drugs may also produce distortions in our reality, which we wouldn't really call hallucinations. Hallucinations are a stimulus that appears real but is not present in reality, versus an illusion, which would be the way we would technically describe a distortion in our sensory experience. All right, so what are hallucinations? What's going on? We think that they are our brain's conscious attempt to try to make sense out of activity that's happening in sensory areas of the brain, in the auditory cortex, the visual cortex, in areas of memory that are stimulating a strong memory. A memory may be so strong that you feel like you're reliving that memory, those sorts of things. So in some ways it can be similar to dreaming. So here we see non-REM sleep and REM sleep, and you can see the big change in brain activity there. And so that increase in brain activity while we're asleep is what happens when we dream, and our brain tries to make sense of that kind of random activity, and that's why dreams can seem surreal or not within the scope of reality, kind of like you can have with hallucinations. And then people who have schizophrenia often have hallucinations as one of their side effects, one of their symptoms. And here we see a patient with schizophrenia listening to recorded speech. So this is what normal auditory stimuli would activate in the brain. And then here we see that same patient or other patients now having an auditory hallucination. So primary auditory cortex is not being stimulated, but these other areas that are activated in our perception of primary auditory cortex are being stimulated in that person. All right, so in general, there's sort of common neurotransmitters that are affected: serotonin, glutamate, particularly through the NMDA receptor, norepinephrine, and acetylcholine. But they don't always act as an agonist, and the antagonizing effect can be due to binding, to being a competitive antagonist where it binds and it doesn't activate that receptor. And we're going to sort of talk about 5 common classes. Your book has a whole bunch of different plants in there. We're going to kind of break them down into 5 classes. And really, we're going to spend most of our time talking about these drugs, about LSD, psilocybin, which are mushrooms, and mescaline, and then PCP and ketamine. So PCP and ketamine can produce hallucinations, but they're called dissociative drugs. They were developed as anesthetics, and so they're slightly different. They have a different mechanism of action, primary action, and slightly different than LSD and psilocybin and mescaline. All right, so psilocybin and mescaline are both serotonin agonists. It's a little more complicated than that. LSD is actually both an agonist and antagonist for serotonin, and probably also acts on NMDA in a secondary manner, but we'll get into that in a minute. Was discovered in 1943 by a chemist that was looking at the chemical medicinal properties of a fungus and isolated this chemical. So when people would eat this fungus, sometimes they would have hallucinations, and he was able to isolate the chemical that was producing those. It was popularized in the 60s and 70s, kind of in the hippie movement. In your case study this week, you'll learn about Aldous Huxley. Timothy Leary was another sort of outspoken proponent for using LSD. And they were proponents, they were outspoken about using it for what they called mind expanding capabilities. They thought that under the influence of these hallucinogenic drugs, you were able to be more creative and more insightful and see reality beyond the confines of your normal world. They have a typically low dosage, producing the euphoric effects similar to marijuana that we'll talk about next week. The average single dose is somewhere between 50 and 150 micrograms. And but some people, heavy users like Huxley, used up to 300 micrograms. Psilocybin is a mushroom species, and their effective dose kind of depends on which species of psilocybin that you use, and I'll talk about that in a minute. Okay. DMT was originally discovered in a plant bark. It's easily synthesized, has a shorter potency, a smaller potency and shorter half-life than LSD, but similar behavioral effects. It can be produced endogenously in humans as an alternate and unusual pathway for serotonin. It's very rare though, and so a study was done that looked at 200 control patients that had no history of mental illness and compared them to people with fairly severe mental health issues, such that they had to be listed as an inpatient on a psychiatric ward. So the controls, only 2 out of 200, or 1% of the controls, had evidence that this alternate metabolic pathway for serotonin was producing DMT. When they looked at the patients on the psychiatric ward, 68% of the autistic patients had this alternative pathway activity. 83% of depressed patients did, and 86% of schizophrenic patients did. So it's unclear exactly what that means, although it could be that having some of this psychedelic drug present as a metabolite could exacerbate maybe those mental health conditions. Mescaline is an active ingredient in the peyote cactus. It is a norepinephrine antagonist. We saw that with amphetamine. It has a fairly long-lasting effect. It's different. People sometimes get mescaline mixed up with mezcal. So mezcal is the ingredient from the agave cactus that's used to make tequila. So you might see mezcal tequila. But very different than mescaline, which comes from the peyote cactus. Typically absorbed through digestion. It's excreted by the liver and metabolized by the liver, but also can be excreted directly. And mescaline has the unpleasant side effect of vomiting and seizure-like tremors immediately after being ingested before you get to the pleasant LSD-like hallucinogenic state. And then finally, salvia is a totally different mechanism. Several different plants work through this mechanism. It's a kappa opioid agonist. So remember we talked about 3 different opioid receptors, kappa being one of those. It's found in a lot of the natural anticholinergic plant hallucinogenic plants, like scopolamine, which also goes by belladonna or deadly nightshade. also found in Jimson weed, mandrake, several other different ones of plants. The problem with these is that in addition to having the sylvia, they also are acetylcholine antagonists, and that often means that they can lead to paralysis and all sorts of things having to do with the neuromuscular junction. And then we have our two dissociative drugs, PCP and ketamine, and these are grouped together because they both antagonize NMDA. They were both developed as anesthetics, as I mentioned, and they had some significant side effects, which are the effects that people often use the drugs for today, which relegated them to only being used as anesthesia in animals. And really, PCP is not used in animals. It's just ketamine that's still used as an anesthetic in animals. The administration of all these drugs can be oral, with the exception of PCP and DMT, which can be injected or snorted or smoked as well. They're readily absorbed from the digestive system. They can be dissolved as teas or into other beverages or mixed into alcoholic beverages. They have a 30 to 60 minute onset, and they have a wide variety of duration. So here you can see a figure from your book, DMT having the shortest duration and LSD having the longest. It could last up to 11 hours. Mescaline also having a pretty long duration there. So a little bit more about PCP. It has a slower onset and it's harder to dose through oral consumption, so it's often smoked or injected. And it's often mixed with other drugs to sort of increase behavioral effects. So you could have a mixture of PCP and cocaine. So you get the stimulation and euphoria of cocaine with the dissociative effects of PCP. Sometimes edible mushrooms are sold as psychedelic mushrooms, but they're just regular shiitake mushrooms that have been laced with PCP. So you're really just taking PCP when you consume them. In terms of metabolism, in general, they're metabolized by the liver, but we did mention that mescaline could be excreted directly. They tend to be metabolized slowly. Obviously, DMT has a very rapid effect, but LSD has a very long effect. So it just sort of depends on which drug we're talking about. Two of the big ones, LSD gets its peak around 3 hours and can last up to 12 hours. Whereas PCP peaks around 15 minutes and lasts to 4 to 6 hours. So when we talk about addictiveness of drugs and we talk about needing to reuse the drug to get the same effect, PCP is a much more addictive type drug than LSD because LSD has such a long effect. All the hallucinogens, all the chemicals are eliminated by the body. They're not stored in body fat or stored in other ways in the body. There's sort of a myth or misconception that flashbacks were the residual drug being re-released into your body from fat or from some other storage mechanism, and that isn't the case. We think flashbacks that occur are a memory, almost like a dream of the behavioral effects, a very strong cognitive memory, so much so that it may even feel like you're experiencing those behavioral effects again, even in the absence of the drug. So that's probably related to the fact that under the influence of these drugs, you're getting very strong memory consolidation because you're activating the limbic system in addition to having these very sort of unusual experiences. All right, neurophysiological effects. We already mentioned that LSD has multiple effects on serotonin, both an agonist and antagonist, and it depends on the sub-receptor type. So here we see that it's an agonist for the serotonin 2A receptor, but it also has a lot of other effects and even some unknown effects on other neurotransmitter systems. And those may be primary effects, but they could also be secondary effects. So here we also see that activating that serotonin 2A receptor can then cause increased glutamate release from glutamate neurons. So if you remember, in general, serotonin is a neuromodulatory neurotransmitter, so it's modulating the effects of other neurotransmitters. Here you see that laundry list of all the different serotonin receptors that LSD can have affinity for, as well as some norepinephrine and dopamine and histamine receptors as well. We think that part of the hallucinogenic effect comes from the antagonism of serotonin. It also inhibits serotonin from release from the Raphe nucleus, but it's an agonist at that 5-HT2A receptor, and that could also be producing hallucinogenic effects. And then, as I mentioned, norepinephrine, histamine for arousal, and dopamine for pleasure. All right, PCP is an antagonist of the NMDA glutamate channel. It's a primary its primary effect is analgesic and amnesic, right? So we already talked about antagonizing NMDA when we talked about Rohypnol and GHB. Some of those drugs had similar analgesic and amnesic effects. But the difference between those drugs and PCP is that PCP also reduces the release of serotonin, and so we get hallucinogenic effects similar to LSD. And then finally, the anticholinergics are blocking that muscarinic receptor for acetylcholine. They're very dangerous. These are a lot of those plant-based drugs like the salvia that we talked about and some of those. All right. So with LSD, the behavioral effects vary depending on where you are in the progression of that drug's effect on your body. So within the first 30 minutes, you get kind of the same effect, but much more subtle as mescaline. So you can have nausea, you can have twitching, you have some anxiety, and then you start to get the distortion of your sensory perceptions within the next 30 to 60 minutes. Over the next 2 hours, it peaks, and then you have this sort of slow return to normal over the next 8 hours or so. There can be some maybe mild withdrawal effects in terms of headache, fatigue. If you've stayed awake, tripping under the influences of LSD for 12 hours, people usually are taking this at night, so then they haven't slept for a whole sleep period. So some of those late effects may be a result of sleep deprivation more than, say, withdrawal, but they kind of mimic withdrawal effects. All right, so we can break that down into somatic, sensory, psychic, or psychedelic experiences. And hallucinations can be dramatically influenced by the sensory environment that you're in. So if you have music or lights or scenery or other stimulating sensory experiences, then that's going to interact with the drug effects as opposed to just sitting in a room, with very little stimulation. You have similar behavioral effects for psilocybin and LSD, but again, psilocybin much shorter effects and typically much less potent. You usually can't ingest enough psilocybin to get to the intensity of the LSD effects. You would probably be at a toxic level. So again, the difference between psilocybin and LSD is in intensity, not necessarily in duration or the types of effects. Now, the behavioral effects for PCP are all coming from a couple of places. One, the major one, is the blockage, the antagonism of the NMDA receptor. And that's going to produce a sort of general inhibitory effect, kind of similar to alcohol. So alcohol is acting through GABA. Here we're blocking glutamate. So similar reduction in excitement in the brain. So you get that general disconnect from reality that we see with alcohol. You'll get the amnesic effect from blocking LTP with the NMDA channel. And then there's also a pleasurable effect. So the positive model of reinforcement and addiction, users will use this for the euphoric and the positive effects. And then the third mechanism that PCP acts on is on the kappa opioid receptor, and it produces an analgesic effect. That also can produce hallucinations as well. And so if you remember, the kappa opioid receptor was also involved with the cough reflex, and so cough syrups act in a milder way on the kappa opioid receptor to reduce coughing. And so people that consume cough syrup in very high amounts may sometimes experience some of these effects of the hallucinogenic effects. All right, so what are the combined effects of PCP? We have somebody that is acting like they're drunk, disinhibited, amnesic, not remembering what's happening, and insensitive to pain. So often this has resulted in unfortunate confrontations with police, because these people are typically violating laws. They're going to be pulled over for DUI. They may be doing inappropriate things because they're disconnected from reality and they don't realize that they're acting in a bizarre manner. And then the fact that they have this pretty significant analgesic effect often makes them resist police and not respond to normal force that police would use. And so police often use excessive force on PCP, on people under the influence of PCP. And there's been several very public sort of police brutality cases that involve people who were on PCP but were not being compliant with the officers. And so it doesn't increase someone's strength, but it increases their tolerance to pain in a way that it appears that they're superhuman strong because they're not responding to the police requests. So there's actually guidelines for police when PCP is expected. They're told to establish a calm environment because this person is disconnected from reality. They need to get backup because they're not going to be able to restrain or take this person into their custody by themselves, even though they may think, this size of a person I could normally handle. They should consider less lethal considerations like tasers or beanbags to help restrain the subject. And you may even need personal protective equipment that we've heard a lot about because of the just sort of the violent nature that these people under this influence of this drug can have. All right, adverse effects. So switching back to LSD. LSD by itself doesn't have very many adverse effects. It's not thought that it causes damage to neurons. Probably not with typical use. Even you'll see in our case study, Crystal Cole had very extensive use of LSD and a variety of psychedelic drugs, and doesn't appear to have any residual effects, mental effects. The secondary problems associated with LSD use is that it can increase psychosis in people that probably were already going to have that psychosis. It's sort of a chicken and egg dilemma. So we don't know if someone in their teens, early 20s that uses a hallucinogenic drug and then starts to have schizophrenic symptoms, if that drug just brought out a pre-existing condition, or if somehow using that drug actually created the schizophrenic condition. We tend to side on the exacerbating rather than causing argument, but again, we don't really know. Most of the adverse effects with hallucinogenic drugs are when people accidentally hurt themselves, sort of similar to alcohol, because they're not aware of their environment. So they have some poor judgment, so they think they can do things like jump off a building, or they get into an accident because they're operating a vehicle or something like that. One of the adverse effects of LSD is that it's so potent, and it's made in these underground labs run by people that are not very morally upstanding. And so the application to the paper that they're usually on is not always precise. So you can get varying amounts of dosage across the different tabs of the paper that are being produced. There can be unknown contaminants. Some LSD has been found to contain strychnine. Strychnine is a convulsant and poison. It can be lethal, but it can also produce hallucinations before it kills you. And so sometimes that's been found as a contaminant in this process. And there's some testing kits that you can buy online, but those typically, these use-at-home testing kits are typically not very effective at detecting the drug or the contaminants that might be in the drug. Hallucinogens are also typically used in combination with alcohol or with marijuana or other stimulants, used in combination with other drugs. And so hallucinogens may not have adverse effects when used in isolation, not unlike what like Adolphus Huxley or Timothy Leary were promoting, but when you start combining them with other recreational drugs, then they can have negative effects. They can have synergistic effects on each other, can have modulatory effects, particularly the use of alcohol or stimulants. So alcohol is going to impair your judgment, so you may begin to use more of the hallucinogen. You may take another round of LSD halfway through your trip that you normally wouldn't have done if you hadn't impaired your judgment with alcohol. Or if you're using stimulants, you may, because of being awake and on methamphetamine or cocaine, you may then reuse the shorter acting hallucinogenic drugs. So sometimes the combination of other drugs can actually increase in an adverse way your consumption of the hallucinogenic drugs. Now, in terms of overdose, there's not much risk of overdose with LSD or psilocybin. PCP can be lethal. Overdose produces coma and respiratory failure, probably because of its actions on the opioid, the kappa opioid receptor. You can also, because of its sort of effects on blood pressure, you can have problems with stroke and kidney failure. With the mushrooms, they have sort of this myth of being safe, right? Because we eat them on salads, they're edible, they're a food. But there's several toxic species that look similar to psilocybin. And so sometimes amateur collectors, come across or looking for these mushrooms out in the wild. They'll come across something that by all means looks like psilocybin, but ends up being not psilocybin and being a toxic mushroom. There's there's many more mushrooms that are toxic than are edible. As I mentioned when we were talking about administration, there are two different species of psilocybin. And one species is much more potent with the chemicals that can affect your brain. And so, depending on which species you get, you could have the effects from 2 to 5 mushrooms versus 10 to 40 mushrooms. So again, a wide range there. And then, as I mentioned earlier, often drug dealers, it's hard to find psilocybin. And if they have customers that want mushrooms, then they may buy edible mushrooms and taint them with PCP or LSD to give the hallucinogenic effects, because it's much easier often to get access to PCP or LSD than the actual psilocybin mushrooms. Tolerance. LSD and mushrooms does tend to develop tolerance if you're continuously using the drugs, but the tolerance also goes away quickly. And those users of those drugs typically are, when they're recreationally using it, use it, experience the effect for that 12-hour period, and then will take 12 or 24 hours off of that drug. Or they'll cycle to a different drug like DMT, which is not going to act on exactly through the same mechanisms, so you won't get cross tolerance across there. And so the sporadic use of those drugs sort of really precludes tolerance from really being an issue in terms of driving continued or increased drug use. With PCP, you do get tolerance. First-time or inexperienced users can get high with 1 or 2 puffs of PCP. Chronic users may have to consume 2 whole smokes of it, joints of it, or bowls of it if they're smoking in pipes. And so this does drive use, the physical dependence model, and it often then leads to criminal acts because the heavy use, the need to acquire more of the drug to get the same effect, is going to be very expensive, and so these people turn to crime in order to finance their drug addiction. In terms of withdrawal, for LSD, as I mentioned before, we really don't see much withdrawal effects. And part of that is due to sort of the long-lasting effects of LSD. So you don't come down quickly from the high where your body then is becoming used to the chemical being there and then it's rapidly not there. It's sort of a gradual onset and a very gradual offset of the behavioral effects, the actions on the neurotransmitters. And as I mentioned, this sort of sporadic use. People don't typically use hallucinogenic drugs like LSD repeatedly in a way that would then produce withdrawal. The withdrawal effects for PCP can be pretty severe. There's motor effects. You can have sedation, sort of the opposite of all the effects that we see. So you see anxiety, confusion. You couple that with the fact they can't remember what's happened, and so there can be fairly severe withdrawal effects for PCP. In terms of addiction, there's not a whole lot of evidence of physical dependence for LSD, psilocybin. There is for PCP. We do see that tolerance that develops and causes increased use, and there's withdrawal effects. So the physical dependence model can be applied to PCP, the dissociative drug, but not really to the hallucinogenic drugs. There's also not much evidence to support psychological dependence, although people do mainly report using this for the positive effects of the drug, and those positive effects could be psychologically dependent. You could have this conditioning use so that every time you're in a particular environment, there's a craving to use that drug. So if you've experienced this drug at a concert or a rave, being in that rave environment could induce cravings for the drug. So given that there's not a whole lot of evidence for addiction with LSD, then one of the questions is, well, what is the harm in using LSD? Should it be criminalized? Should it be illegal? Or should it be legalized? PCP, I think we could probably all agree that it's not safe to use recreationally in terms of the behavioral effects, the tolerance, the withdrawal, the addictive types of effects of that. All right, so I'm going to post your case studies as well in a worksheet for you to turn in, and that is all of your work for this week. Your next lecture will be posted before Monday, and that'll be on MDMA and ecstasy, and you'll have a case study on that as well. I hope you're all doing well, staying safe, enjoying your time, hopefully with your family, and even though we have to physically distance ourselves to prevent the spread of this virus and to keep ourselves healthy and from not getting sick, you guys know, as your generation, that you don't have to socially isolate. You can be on your devices, you can FaceTime, you can group chat, you can do all the things to stay connected with your friends, and I hope you're doing that. All right, stay safe and be well.